Professor Said, do the Zionists have any historical claim to the lands of Israel?
Of course, but I would not say that the Jewish claim, or the Zionist claim, is the only claim or the main claim. I say that it is a claim among many others. Certainly the Arabs have a much greater claim because they've had a longer history of inhabitants, of actual residents in Palestine, than the Jews did. If you look at the history of Palestine, there's been some quite interesting work done by biblical archaeologists. You'll see that the period of actual Israelite, as it was called in the Old Testament, dominance in Palestine amounts to about 200 to 250 years. But there were Moabites, there were Jebusites, there were Canaanites, there were Philistines, there were many other people in Palestine at the time and before and after. And to isolate one of them and say that's the real owner of the land, I mean, that is fundamentalism. Because the only way you could back it up is say, well, God gave it to us. Yes, but I mean, Christians think that God gave it to them, and Muslims think that God gave it to them. I mean, that's not a rational argument. So I think the people who have a history of residence in Palestine for a certain amount of time, including the Jews, yes, and, of course, the Arabs, have a claim. But, and this is very important, I don't think any claim, I don't care whether it's given by God, about whom I have many doubts, by the way, or by the emperor, nobody has a claim that overrides all the others and entitles that person with that so-called claim to drive people out. I mean, that's the point. This is a very, very important point. I mean, Jews have a claim, and I've never denied that. Of course they do. But is it a claim that can tell a Palestinian, well, you've got to leave this house because I mean, I got it 3,000 years ago. I mean, it's true I come from Poland or from Brooklyn, but I have a bigger right to this house than you do. So get out. I'm sorry, I disagree with that kind of logic. And if there was some way, as there seems to be now, there's a formula accepted by the world, and shared also with many Israelis and many Palestinians, many Arabs, for sharing the land. I mean, I think that's the better way to look at it than say, no, one claim is superior to all the others.
One last question, but it's the one that is the most common thread throughout all the ones that I've had a chance to look at, and it goes something like this. What specifically can we do to change U.S. policy to help bring about a just peace in the Middle East?
Very clear. We must join the rest of the world in our policy. The European Union, the Organization of African Unity, the non-aligned, I mentioned the European Union, the Asian powers. In short, the entire world, with the exception of Israel and the United States, and I think Costa Rica and Micronesia, who always vote against these things, have had before them a set of UN resolutions that are in the books now, at least since 1967. We went to war in Iraq saying that he violated UN resolutions. Well, we've done the same. It is the only honorable thing to do, and to expect our representatives to vote, instead of sending letters, dear colleague letters, to the White House, having senators who are, puppets of the Israeli lobby, writing letters and say, Israel should be supported against Palestinian terrorism. We should tell these so-called representatives of ours that they don't know what they're talking about. That in fact Israel has violated, as we have violated, UN resolutions, UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions that make it quite clear that Israel has to end the occupation, withdraw from the occupied territories of 1967, including Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and accept the world consensus. There's not, when you think about it, there's nothing to be negotiated on. These are occupied territory. I mean, we need people like Rami Rumsfeld to tell us these are so-called, well, they were occupied in 67, and according to the UN, according to the World Court, according to international law, according to every known standard, Israel has no right to be there. So, we need to mobilize our communities, our representatives, in Washington, to tell them this is what we want. We want the United States to follow its own precepts, supposed precepts in Iraq, in the Middle East, to say to Israel, out. The time has come. It's not about, there's nothing to negotiate. You don't negotiate over illegal occupied territory. It's like negotiating on the theft of a house. What are you going to negotiate about? You'll get half a door back, or maybe just a garage. You negotiate the return of stolen or illegally occupied property. So it's basically so simple that we must demand of our own government, and especially of the Congress, that the United States ought to comply with the accepted world consensus as embodied in resolutions 242 and 338, passed originally in 1967, still on the books, affirmed, confirmed, etc., many times. The U.S. is talking about vetoes. We've vetoed, I don't know, 60 resolutions on things like the occupation of Jerusalem and the annexation of Jerusalem, all kinds of things. At last we come back to the basic proposition that this is a land for two peoples who have to live there, not one people on top of the other, or one people ruling another, but two people in equality, in full self-determination. It's a very simple program. And that this is the will of the citizens of the United States who are members of the world community. We're not a race apart. We're not a special people in that sense that we are set a different agenda. I think that's wrong. And I think that's a recipe for further disaster for us as well as for the rest of the world. So it's a simple thing, I think. But it requires work, it requires commitment, and above all, it requires knowledge. I mean, one has to inform oneself what has really happened and not be, what is happening on the ground, and not be satisfied with the media cliches that we get all the time. In fact, we don't even get those anymore. I mean, the proportion of the 22.5 minutes today on the evening national news, if you watch them still, I don't think many people do, because it's all, you know, it's kind of mostly is rubbish. But the amount of foreign coverage is something like less than 10% of that. So it means 2.5 minutes per evening is devoted to foreign news. I'm leaving aside Iraq for the moment. So we don't get any idea of what's going on. We have to inform ourselves. Last point to be made, I'm sorry, I should have made it earlier. Thank God for the internet. There are so many alternatives. There's so many alternative sources of information now, so that nobody can say, well, I didn't know. So I think the first duty is to inform yourself, mobilize, and pressure your representatives to end the injustice and the inequality.